Sunny California, palm trees swaying gently, and a perfectly manicured suburban paradise. That's where my wife, Sarah, and I had carved out our little slice of the American dream. We had a cozy house, a charming garden, and a ridiculously overpriced coffee machine that Sarah swore made the world's best lattes. Life was good, serene even, until she arrived. Cue the dramatic music and a gust of wind that somehow only blows dead leaves directly onto our driveway. That's right, I'm talking about Karen. Not just any Karen, mind you, but the Karen. The queen bee of the Homeowners Association, the self-appointed guardian of suburban homogeneity, and the bane of our perfectly pleasant existence. Sarah, my wife, is a brilliant lawyer. Seriously, she's a legal ninja. Graduated top of her class, could argue her way out of a black hole, the whole shebang. Oh, and she happens to be wheelchair-bound. A car accident a few years back changed things, but it didn't dim her spirit or her razor-sharp intellect. If anything, it made her even more determined to fight for what's right. And trust me, when Karen came along, Sarah knew a fight was brewing. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to have dedicated her life to finding things to complain about. Her natural habitat was the HOA meeting, where she would hold court, armed with a binder full of meticulously highlighted regulations and a permanent frown etched onto her face. She was like a suburban supervillain, but instead of world domination, her goal was to make sure everyone's lawn was exactly 2.5 inches high and that their holiday decorations were tasteful. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a passive-aggressive note slipped under our door. It was printed on pastel pink paper, naturally, and signed a concerned neighbor. It read, "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that your modified parking situation is not in compliance with the aesthetic standards of our community. While we sympathize with your circumstances, we must also uphold the values of property values and visual appeal. Please rectify the situation promptly. Sincerely, but not really, a concerned neighbor who is totally Karen." Now, let me translate. We had a designated handicapped parking spot installed in front of our house to accommodate Sarah's wheelchair. It was perfectly legal, approved by the city, and frankly, essential for Sarah to get in and out of the house. But to Karen, it was an eyesore, a blight on her perfectly curated neighborhood. I remember Sarah reading the note, her eyebrows slowly rising. She let out a dry chuckle. "Well, Mark," she said, "looks like we're about to have some fun." And fun it was not. The notes kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. Apparently, our azaleas were the wrong shade of pink. Our mailbox was leaning slightly to the left, and our welcome mat was too welcoming. I kid you not. But the real kicker was when Karen started targeting Sarah directly. She would make snide remarks at HOA meetings, subtly implying that Sarah's disability made her a burden on the community. She would stare pointedly at Sarah's wheelchair, as if it were some kind of alien spacecraft that had landed in her precious neighborhood. One time, I overheard Karen talking to another neighbor, saying, "It's just not fair to the rest of us. We work so hard to maintain our properties, and then that just brings everything down." I wanted to march over there and give her a piece of my mind, but Sarah stopped me. "Don't," she said. "Don't give her the satisfaction. We're going to fight this, but we're going to do it smart." And that's when I knew that Karen had messed with the wrong wheelchair-bound lawyer. Sarah started researching the HOA rules, the city ordinances, and every legal loophole she could find. She was like a woman possessed, fueled by righteous anger and a venti-sized latte. She discovered that Karen had been bending the rules for years, using her position as HOA president to bully other neighbors and line her own pockets. For instance, there was the case of Mrs. Henderson, who had been forced to remove her prize-winning rose bushes because they were too fragrant. Turns out, Karen was allergic to roses and just didn't want to smell them. Then there was Mr. Peterson, who had been fined for painting his house the wrong shade of beige. Coincidentally, Karen's cousin owned a painting company that offered HOA-approved colors at exorbitant prices. The more Sarah dug, the more dirt she found. It was like uncovering a whole underground network of suburban corruption, all orchestrated by our dear Karen. And so the battle lines were drawn. It was Karen, the queen of the HOA, versus Sarah, the wheelchair-bound lawyer with a thirst for justice, and a killer legal strategy. So after the pastel pink passive-aggressive notes, things escalated. It was like Karen had declared a personal vendetta against our house, our garden, and basically our entire existence. The HOA violations started piling up faster than I could mow the lawn, which, by the way, was apparently 0.3 inches too long according to Karen's meticulous measurements. We got cited for everything imaginable. The color of our trash cans, apparently, they clashed with the overall community aesthetic. The placement of our garden gnomes, they were deemed too whimsical. And even the way our dog, Winston, barked, apparently, his woof was disruptive to the tranquility of the neighborhood. I swear, if Karen could have fined us for breathing, she would have. Sarah, bless her heart, was trying to remain calm, but even her patience was wearing thin. She spent hours poring over the HOA bylaws, trying to find some kind of legal basis for Karen's madness. But the bylaws were a tangled mess of vague language and contradictory clauses, seemingly designed to give the HOA president unlimited power. It's like they wrote this thing on a dare, Sarah muttered one evening, rubbing her temples. There's no logic, no reason, just pure, unadulterated suburban tyranny. But Sarah wasn't just going to roll over and take it. Oh no, she was formulating a plan, a brilliant, Machiavellian scheme to take down Karen and restore sanity to our little corner of suburbia. Her first move was to document everything. Every violation, every snide remark, every ridiculous demand. She kept a meticulously detailed log, complete with dates, times, and photographic evidence. It was like she was building a legal fortress, brick by brick. Then, she started attending the HOA meetings. Now, these meetings were usually sparsely attended, consisting mostly of Karen and a handful of other retirees who were easily swayed by her pronouncements. But Sarah's presence changed everything. She would sit there in her wheelchair, a calm and collected figure amidst the chaos, and calmly dismantle Karen's arguments, one by one. Mrs. Johnson, Karen would say, her voice dripping with condescension, we've received complaints about the excessive number of inflatable decorations on your lawn. According to Section 3.2, subsection B, paragraph 7 of the HOA bylaws, Sarah would reply, inflatable decorations are only prohibited if they exceed 6 feet in height. My inflatable flamingo is a mere 5 feet, 11 inches. Therefore, it is in full compliance. You could practically see the steam coming out of Karen's ears. But Sarah didn't stop there. She started using Karen's own tactics against her. She would file complaints about Karen's overgrown rose bushes, her improperly aligned garden hose, and her disturbingly loud wind chimes. It was a tit-for-tat battle of suburban warfare, and it was glorious to watch. One evening, Sarah discovered something truly scandalous. Buried deep within the HOA's financial records, she found evidence that Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for her personal expenses. We're talking about lavish spa treatments, designer handbags, and a suspiciously large number of landscaping consultations from a company owned by Karen's brother-in-law. Bingo, Sarah said, a triumphant glint in her eyes. Looks like our Karen has been dipping her hand in the cookie jar. This was it, the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that could bring Karen down for good. But Sarah knew she had to play her cards right. She couldn't just accuse Karen outright. She needed to build a case, a solid legal argument that would stand up in court. So, she started digging deeper, interviewing other neighbors, gathering more evidence, and building a network of allies who were just as fed up with Karen's tyranny as we were. And that's when things started to get really interesting. We discovered that Karen had a long history of bullying and intimidation. She had driven several families out of the neighborhood with her relentless harassment. She had even been accused of tampering with a neighbor's car after they refused to comply with her demands. It was like we had opened Pandora's box, unleashing a torrent of suburban secrets and petty grievances. But amidst all the chaos, there was a sense of hope. People were finally standing up to Karen, refusing to be silenced. Sarah, in her wheelchair, was leading the charge, a symbol of defiance against the forces of suburban oppression. She was like a modern-day Joan of Arc, but instead of leading an army into battle, she was leading a group of disgruntled homeowners into an HOA meeting. She sued us, Yes, sued us. For what, you ask? A persistent pattern of HOA violations and intentional disregard for community standards. I swear, I almost choked on my morning coffee when I saw the lawsuit. Karen, in her infinite wisdom, had decided that the best way to resolve our little dispute was to drag us into the legal arena. I guess she figured that a courtroom would be her natural habitat, a place where her superior intellect and impeccable fashion sense would give her an unbeatable advantage. Little did she know, she was walking right into Sarah's trap. We hired a lawyer, a nice, mild-mannered guy named Mr. Henderson. Not the same Mrs. Henderson who had her roses murdered by Karen, but still, he seemed competent enough, but Sarah insisted on taking the lead. I want to face her myself, she said, her eyes gleaming with determination. This is personal. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood about the showdown between Karen and the wheelchair lawyer, and everyone wanted a front row seat. It was like a reality TV show, but with more legal jargon and fewer commercial breaks. Karen arrived in full Karen regalia. A power suit, stilettos that looked like they could kill a man, and a smug expression that could curdle milk. She was accompanied by her own lawyer, a slick, smarmy guy who looked like he had just stepped out of a used car commercial. Sarah, on the other hand, arrived in her wheelchair, dressed in a simple but elegant dress. She looked calm, confident, and utterly unfazed by the spectacle. I, of course, was a nervous wreck, pacing back and forth like a caged tiger. The trial began, and Karen's lawyer started by laying out the case against us. He presented photos of our offending azaleas, our misaligned mailbox, and our whimsical garden gnomes. He argued that we were deliberately flouting the HOA rules and undermining the community's aesthetic values. It was all incredibly tedious and utterly ridiculous. But then, Karen took the stand, and that's when things got really interesting. She started by painting herself as a victim, a selfless guardian of the community who was simply trying to uphold the rules and protect property values. She claimed that we were troublemakers, out to disrupt the peace and tranquility of the neighborhood. And then she went for the jugular. She started attacking Sarah directly, questioning her competence, her motives, and even her right to live in our community. She implied that Sarah's disability made her a burden on the neighborhood and that she was using her wheelchair to garner sympathy and manipulate the system. And then she did it. She actually did it. She leaned forward, pointed her finger directly at Sarah and said, "You know, if you weren't in that thing, maybe you'd understand the importance of keeping up appearances. But you're just dragging us all down." The courtroom went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. I saw Sarah's face flush with anger, but she remained remarkably composed. "Objection!" Mr. Henderson shouted, jumping to his feet. "That's irrelevant, prejudicial, and utterly disgusting." The judge, a stern-looking woman with a no-nonsense attitude, glared at Karen. "Mrs. Smith," she said, "I suggest you watch your tone. This is a court of law, not a playground for your personal prejudices." Karen, momentarily taken aback, stammered an apology. But the damage was done. She had shown her true colors, revealing herself to be the petty, vindictive bully that we all knew she was. It was Sarah's turn to cross-examine Karen, and she approached the witness stand with a steely glint in her eyes. She started by calmly questioning Karen about her qualifications for being HOA president, her knowledge of the bylaws, and her understanding of disability rights. Then she started to dig deeper. She asked Karen about the HOA funds, the landscaping consultations, and the spa treatments. She presented documents and emails that clearly showed Karen had been using HOA money for her personal benefit. Karen, caught off guard, started to sweat. She stammered. She deflected. She tried to deny everything. But Sarah was relentless, like a legal pit bull who had sunk her teeth into her prey. And then Sarah played her trump card. She introduced evidence that Karen had a long history of harassing and intimidating other neighbors, driving several families out of the community. She called witnesses to the stand who testified about Karen's bullying tactics, her petty grievances, and her overall reign of terror. The courtroom erupted in chaos. The judge banged her gavel, trying to restore order. Karen's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under a rock and die. And Sarah? She just sat there in her wheelchair, a triumphant smile on her face. She had finally exposed Karen for who she really was. A petty, vindictive, and utterly corrupt bully who had abused her power and terrorized her neighbors. Karen, red-faced and sputtering, tried desperately to deny the mounting evidence against her, but it was like trying to hold back a tsunami with a teacup. Sarah had unleashed a wave of truth, and there was nothing Karen could do to stop it. Remember those neighbors who'd been driven out by Karen's reign of terror? Well, Sarah had tracked them down. One by one, they took the stand, their voices trembling as they recounted their experiences. There was Mrs. Gable, who was forced to sell her house after Karen complained about her unsightly bird feeders, which, by the way, were perfectly legal. There was Mr. Chun, who was fined into oblivion for daring to paint his front door a shade of red that Karen deemed unacceptable. And then there was poor Mrs. Rodriguez, who was practically run out of town after Karen spread rumors that she was running a suspicious business out of her home. It was a perfectly legitimate Etsy shop selling hand-knitted scarves. Each story was more outrageous than the last, painting a picture of Karen as a tyrannical HOA despot who ruled with an iron fist and a complete disregard for basic human decency. But the real bombshell came when Sarah introduced a surprise witness, a former HOA board member named Mr. Abernathy. He was a mild-mannered accountant who had served on the board with Karen for several years. He'd always seemed like a meek and unassuming guy, but apparently, he had been secretly documenting Karen's misdeeds for years. Mr. Abernathy calmly testified about how Karen had systematically manipulated the HOA's finances, using her position to funnel money into her own pockets. He presented a series of meticulously detailed spreadsheets that showed exactly how Karen had diverted funds for personal expenses, from lavish spa treatments to designer handbags to suspiciously frequent landscaping consultations from her brother-in-law's company. I tried to raise concerns about these irregularities, Mr. Abernathy said, his voice barely above a whisper. But Mrs. Smith would always dismiss them or worse, threaten me with legal action. I was afraid to speak out, but I couldn't stand by and watch her continue to abuse her power. The courtroom was dead silent as Mr. Abernathy laid out the evidence, piece by piece. Even Karen's lawyer looked like he wanted to disown her. Finally, it was Sarah's turn to deliver her closing argument. She stood up from her wheelchair, her voice ringing with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "this case is not about azaleas or mailboxes or garden gnomes. It's about power, abuse, and the fundamental right of every individual to live in peace and dignity. Mrs. Smith has used her position as HOA president to bully, harass, and intimidate her neighbors. She has violated their rights, stolen their money, and made their lives a living hell. And for what? For her own personal gain, for her own twisted sense of power." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. "I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, is this the kind of community we want to live in? A community where one person can dictate the rules, trample on the rights of others, and get away with it? I think not. I urge you to find Mrs. Smith guilty of all charges and send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated." And then, she dropped the mic metaphorically, of course. She couldn't actually drop the mic from her wheelchair, but the effect was the same. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. I paced back and forth in the hallway, my nerves shot to hell. Sarah, meanwhile, sat calmly in her wheelchair, reading a book. She was the picture of serenity, as if she had no doubt about the outcome. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression, read the verdict. "We find the defendant, Karen Smith, guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted in cheers. People were hugging, high-fiving, and even popping champagne, which, by the way, is probably against some obscure HOA rule. Karen, meanwhile, looked like she had been struck by lightning. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her lawyer rushed to her side, whispering frantically in her ear. The judge ordered Karen to pay a hefty fine, reimburse the HOA for the stolen funds, and perform community service. But the real punishment was the humiliation. She had been exposed, disgraced, and utterly defeated in front of the entire community. As she was led out of the courtroom, a chorus of boos and jeers followed her. She tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. After months of harassment and intimidation, Karen had finally gotten what she deserved. The karma bus had arrived, and it had run her over, repeatedly. So Karen got her comeuppance in court. But that wasn't the end of the story. Oh no, the aftermath was even more delicious than the verdict itself. First of all, Karen was immediately ousted from her position as HOA president. Turns out, embezzlement and tyrannical behavior aren't exactly conducive to community leadership. The HOA held a special election, and guess who everyone wanted to replace her? That's right, Sarah. Now, Sarah initially hesitated. She wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of spending her time wrangling over lawn heights and mailbox placements. But she realized that this was an opportunity to make real change, to create a more inclusive and equitable community. So, she ran for HOA president, and the election was a landslide. Even Karen's remaining supporters couldn't deny the overwhelming tide of public opinion. Sarah was in and Karen was out. For good. The first thing Sarah did as HOA president was to rewrite the bylaws. She eliminated all the petty, arbitrary rules that Karen had used to harass her neighbors. She created a clear and transparent process for resolving disputes, ensuring that everyone had a fair hearing. And she established a committee to review and revise the HOA's financial practices to prevent any future embezzlement. But Sarah didn't stop there. She realized that Karen's reign of terror had left deep scars on the community. People were afraid to speak out, afraid to challenge authority. So, Sarah made it her mission to create a culture of openness, transparency, and collaboration. She held town hall meetings where she listened to the concerns of her neighbors. She created online forums where people could share ideas and voice their opinions. And she made herself available to anyone who needed help or support. Slowly but surely, the community began to heal. People started to trust each other again, to work together, to build a better neighborhood. The HOA meetings, once dreaded events filled with tension and animosity, became productive and even enjoyable gatherings. And what about Karen? Well, she became a pariah. Her friends abandoned her, her neighbors shunned her, and her social life evaporated. She was forced to sell her house and move out of the community, leaving behind a legacy of shame and disgrace. But that wasn't the end of Karen's story. Remember how I said she had to perform community service? Well, the judge, in a moment of poetic justice, assigned her to work at a local disability center. Can you imagine the irony? Karen, the woman who had discriminated against Sarah for her disability, was now forced to serve the very community she had tried to marginalize. I heard from a reliable source, okay? It was Mrs. Henderson, the Rose Lady, that Karen was absolutely miserable at the disability center. She complained constantly, refused to help the clients, and generally made a nuisance of herself. But the staff at the center were tough, and they didn't let her get away with anything. They made her work hard, and they forced her to confront her own prejudices and biases. And, believe it or not, something amazing happened. Over time, Karen started to change. She began to see the people at the disability center as individuals, not just as those people in wheelchairs. She started to understand their struggles, their challenges, and their triumphs. And she began to realize the harm that she had done. One day, Sarah received a letter from Karen. It was a long, rambling letter filled with apologies, regrets, and a genuine desire to make amends. Karen admitted that she had been wrong, that she had let her prejudices cloud her judgment, and that she was ashamed of her behavior. She asked Sarah for forgiveness. Now, I'm not going to lie, I was skeptical. I didn't think Karen was capable of genuine remorse. But Sarah, being the bigger person, decided to give her a chance. She invited Karen to have coffee with her, and they talked for hours. Sarah listened patiently as Karen poured out her heart. And, to my surprise, I started to believe that Karen was truly sorry. But that wasn't the end of the story. Inspired by her experience with Karen, Sarah decided to take her advocacy work to the next level. She started a non-profit organization dedicated to fighting discrimination and promoting disability rights. She gave speeches, wrote articles, and testified before Congress. She became a national voice for the disabled community. And guess who became one of her most ardent supporters? That's right, Karen. Karen volunteered her time, donated money, and used her newfound understanding to educate others about disability rights. She even became a board member of Sarah's nonprofit organization. It was the most unlikely of friendships, but it was also the most inspiring. Karen, the former HOA tyrant, had become an advocate for the very people she had once oppressed. As for Sarah, she became a local hero. She was honored with awards, featured in magazines, and even invited to the White House. But the most rewarding thing for her was the knowledge that she had made a real difference in the lives of others. And that, my friends, is the ultimate Karen payback. Not just the humiliation in court, but the transformation of a bully into an advocate, the healing of a community, and the empowerment of the marginalized. So, the next time you encounter a Karen in your life, remember Sarah's story. Remember that even the most stubborn and hateful people can change. And remember that sometimes the best revenge is not just to win, but to inspire others to do better.